Chapter 13. Jessica practically stumbled over a scruffy-looking homeless man sitting on the sidewalk outside the Journal building Thursday morning, his face covered by a floppy old hat. As she entered the newsroom, Jessica nearly stumbled again, this time over a row of rickety folding chairs that were stacked against the wall. In fact, she realized the entire room was in chaos. A massive desk appeared out of nowhere and bumped toward her, rapidly carried, she saw, by two men in coveralls. Jessica scrunched against the wall to keep from being mowed down. "What's going on here?" she called after them. "We were told to move the desks out of the way to set up seats for a press conference, miss," one of the workers said in a Cockney accent. "A press conference about what?" The man shook his head. "I sure as blazes don't know, miss. I just move furniture." The workers moved on. Jessica bit her lip, suddenly afraid. The only really big scoop she knew of was that the police would be looking for Robert soon. Could that be the topic of the press conference? Was her innocent boyfriend's name about to drag through the mud? She considered the possibility for a moment but rejected it. The Journal wouldn't hold a press conference on a murder investigation. The police department would do it. At least she hoped so. Then Jessica caught sight of Luke as he ducked under a huge boom microphone that a woman was setting up outside the door of Tony's office. She scrambled over to him. "What's the press conference for?" Luke smiled sheepishly. "Sorry, Jessica, but your sister and Tony have sworn me to secrecy." "Elizabeth knows about all this?" Jessica asked, gesturing around at the confusion. "I wondered why she was already gone when I woke up. But come on, Luke. Liz couldn't have meant me when she asked you not to tell anybody. Liz and I are identical twins. Telling me something is just like telling her." "Valiant attempt, Jessica, but Elizabeth specifically warned me not to say anything to you. I believe she mentioned something about a mouth the size of Westminster Abbey." Jessica scowled. "Thanks a lot. Well, I see her near the copying machine, talking to Tony. Maybe I can wheedle it out of them." She began striding across the room to confront her sister. Then she remembered what Luke had said, and opted for a more subtle approach. She slipped behind a pair of desks that were stacked one behind the other and trained a practiced ear on her sister's conversation with the editor. "Thanks for calling me last night with the big news," Tony said. "And for helping me arrange this press conference on such short notice." Elizabeth smiled. "And thank you for letting me write a really big story. Finally." "It was an excellent article," Tony said. Then he smiled mischievously. "I suppose you've already prepared your acceptance speech for your first Pulitzer." Elizabeth blushed, and Jessica knew she'd been dreaming of exactly that. "What about the people back in the press room?" Elizabeth asked. "Certainly. They'll see the story when they print the newspaper. Can you trust them to keep it under wraps?" "They're all sworn to secrecy," Tony replied. "In fact, they're printing the special edition right now. It'll be off the presses in time for the 10 a.m. conference." Jessica wished she had taken the time to flirt with some of the guys in the press room. Maybe they would have told her the big secret. "Will our special guests be here in time?" Tony asked. "No problem there, Liz says. What about Pembroke?" "He'll be here, and I asked him to bring Thatcher as well. I told Pembroke the gist of today's announcement but not the details. I assume he's too distracted with his own problems to be angry at me for taking the liberty of setting all this up. If he's upset, I could be joining Lucy on the dole. That reminds me, did you call her? Is she coming?" "It was a hard sell, Tony, but I think so. She's still angry with you, but I appealed to her journalist's sense of curiosity." Tony rushed off to supervise the placement of the chairs, and Jessica leapt out from behind the desks. "What was that all about?" she demanded. "What press conference? What article?" Elizabeth gave her a smug, infuriating smile. "You'll know soon enough." Elizabeth chuckled to herself as she saw Jessica's infuriated expression. Jessica had never been a patient person. Now she would just have to wait for the press conference to start like everyone else. Reporters from other newspapers were beginning to arrive. All they had been told was that Lord Pembroke had a major announcement to make. Now they were milling around the room, asking questions of one another and speculating about the answers. Elizabeth noticed Lucy standing alone and realized she was carefully avoiding Tony, though she had been too curious to stay away. "Oh well," Elizabeth thought. "At least she's here." Jessica pointed toward the door. Television cameras, she exclaimed. Does my hair look all right? It looks fine, Jessica, as usual. But it won't matter. The BBC television. People are not here to take pictures of you. You never know, Jessica said. But look, there's Emily with the crew. Some media groups let their student interns come along on the big stories. Emily caught sight of the twins and hurried over to them, dodging a radio crew. On the way, Luke joined them a moment later. What's the big scoop? Emily asked excitedly. Do you journal insiders have any inside information? Jessica scowled. You know how much of an insider I am. If it doesn't deal with exploding vegetables, clog robbers, or falling kitchen sinks, I'm left in the dark. Elizabeth and Luke are in on the secret. Elizabeth even wrote the big exclusive in the special edition of the newspaper that's coming out today. But she's taken a vow of silence. Some of the BBC reporters think it's about the princess, Emily said. Have they found her? Elizabeth shrugged, but kept her mouth shut. No way, Jessica said, with a speculative glance at her sister. Liz couldn't have kept something that big from me. Here's Lord Pembroke now, Emily said. Lord Pembroke walked hurriedly into the room, followed by Andrew Thatcher. The men were obviously together, but there was a coldness between them that aroused Elizabeth's curiosity, and Thatcher's eyes looked blazing mad. Luke took her arm and drew her aside from the others. Do you suppose Pembroke told Thatcher about Robert at 10 o'clock last night as scheduled? He whispered. Elizabeth cast another glance across the room at the two men. My guess is yes, but Thatcher looks mad. I bet he's figured out that Pembroke told Robert to leave town. We've got every journalist in town assembled here, Luke pointed out. I wonder if Thatcher will take advantage of the opportunity to announce a warrant for little Lord Pembroke's arrest. Elizabeth bit her lip. I hope not, for Jessica's sake. I was counting on today's revelation to help people see that the journal has been hiding the murders. But I'd rather see Robert brought in quietly. Any word from Bumpo on the forensic studies? Not yet. Elizabeth felt a tap on her shoulder. Didn't anyone ever tell you it's impolite to whisper? Jessica demanded. Besides, something's happening over there. She pointed. Isn't that yesterday evening's paper Pembroke is reading? He looks mad. Lord Pembroke folded the newspaper in a quick, jerking movement. Then he glared around the room. Find Reeves, he yelled to a terrified reporter. I want him in my office now. Then he stalked across the floor, ignoring the questions of a half-dozen journalists, and disappeared into his corner office. A buzz of speculation arose from the gathered reporters. A moment later, Reeves emerged from his own office and strolled over to Pembroke's, a jaunty swing in his walk. Elizabeth looked at Jessica, and both twins nodded. Then they motioned for Luke and Emily to follow as they slipped behind a row of stacked desks and picked their way unseen to a spot near Pembroke's door. Lucy Friday obviously had the same idea. She was already standing near the door when Elizabeth led the others around the stacked desks. Lucy put a finger to her lips as the teenagers approached. Reeves's proud voice filtered through the door. Lord Pembroke, sir, I knew you would be pleased with this week's circulation figures. Yesterday's edition sold more papers than anything since the royal wedding. The princess death story really did the trick. Tony Frank didn't want to print it without more research, but I wasn't about to let him dictate editorial policy. The man's a neophyte, has no business sense at all. I went right ahead against his objections. Lucy gasped, her face filled with shame and hope. Pembroke cleared his throat. I'll see that you get exactly what you deserve, he said in a voice so low that Elizabeth had to strain her ears to catch his words. Reeves didn't seem to notice the forbidding tone in Pembroke's voice. And today's special edition, sir, should top even yesterday's sales. I know you haven't seen the article yet, but believe me, it will be the scoop of the century. And as I understand it, Tony Frank and his staff were responsible for the news we will reveal today. Yes, sir, Reeves said, sounding confused. But only under my direction. Of course. Of course. Actually, sir, I would recommend replacing Mr. Frank immediately. The man obviously can't handle his new responsibilities. Pembroke's response was calm, but held a note of rage. It is you who will be replaced, he said. For knowingly printing an unsubstantiated rumor, your employment is hereby terminated. But sir, Reeves stammered, it was you who told me to play up the princess story instead of focusing on the murders, to find new angles. What murders? Emily mouthed to Jessica. Jessica shook her head, listening. These Americans, Emily thought, certainly had a taste for the morbid. I never told you to print lies, Pembroke said, his voice rising. Choosing to print one story over another is a simple matter of editorial judgment. But choosing to print a story that is not true is blatantly irresponsible. There is no room in my newspaper for lies. See that your belongings are out of the building by the end of the day. The newsroom was electric with excitement as everyone prepared for the press conference to begin. Emily could feel it pulsing around her in the hurried movements of the reporters and in their eager conversations. She fidgeted in her front row seat between Jessica and Luke, and then turned to see if all the seats behind them were full. It's standing room only, she remarked. How about a hint, Liz? Jessica pleaded, craning her neck to see her sister, who was seated past Luke. Just give me a teensy-weensy little hint of what this is all about. Elizabeth refused, and Jessica slumped in her seat, her arms folded across her chest. Emily knew she hated feeling left out. Cheer up, Jessica, she said. There's a lot you can tell me. Who's the good-looking young man in front of the room, the one who seems so nervous? Jessica yawned. Oh, that's just Tony Frank, my boss. Officially this may be Pembroke's press conference, but from what I gather Tony's running the show. He's kind of a wimp, but he's a nice enough guy. Your friend Lucy can't seem to keep her eyes off him. Jessica smiled. You're right. I hadn't noticed. We've been trying to get those two back together all week. I'm glad it's finally working. What was Mr. Reeves saying earlier about covering up some murders? Nobody else even seemed surprised. I know a young woman was killed at Pembroke Manor last week. Have there been other murders as well? Does Lord Pembroke know who committed them? Jessica gasped. No, she said, loud enough so that several heads turned. He doesn't know anything about who killed those people, she whispered. The evidence is wrong. Emily was perplexed, but didn't want to provoke Jessica further. Then Tony stepped up to the microphone, and the room quieted instantly. We've all been regaled for the last week or two with information and speculation about the disappearance of the Queen's youngest daughter, Princess Eliana. A murmur rose from the crowd of reporters. Behind her, Emily recognized the frantic scratching of pens on notepaper and the furious clicking of keys on laptop computers. Had the missing princess been found? Lord Pembroke has an important presentation to make in a few minutes, but first I'd like to introduce somebody. That's Tony's office door he's pointing to, Jessica whispered. Do you think he's got the princess in there? Emily held her breath as the door opened. Then she let it out, surprised and disappointed. David Bartholomew stepped out of the office, grinning nervously. What in the world is David the bookworm doing here? Jessica whispered as David and Tony conferred in low voices for a moment. Emily shook her head, mystified. I can't imagine a shy fellow like him speaking to all these reporters, she whispered back. Elizabeth and Luke, she noticed, didn't seem the least bit surprised. Tony grasped the microphone again. This young man is Mr. David Bartholomew, and he has a very important announcement to make. David's voice was shaky when he began speaking. I met somebody a couple weeks ago who seemed quite extraordinary, but I didn't realize just how extraordinary until yesterday evening when I saw her photograph on the front page of the London Journal. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present the Princess Eliana. Tony unfurled a newspaper that Emily realized was a copy of the journal's hot off the presses special edition. A huge headline blazed across the top of the page. Eliana is found. University student turns in missing princess. Then Eliana herself stepped out of Tony's office, looking quite regal in a white silk dress with her hair piled on top of her head. But her hair was brown instead of blonde. Emily nearly fell off her seat. The princess was Lena Smith. Jessica, next to Emily, was opening and closing her mouth like a guppy. Only Elizabeth sat calmly, not the least bit surprised. We've been living with a real honest-to-goodness princess, Jessica blurted out, and we didn't even know it. Tony's assistant passed out copies of the special edition as Lena Eliana, Emily reminded herself, held a whispered conversation with Tony, David, and Lord Pembroke, who had joined them at the front of the room. "Congratulations, Liz," Emily said, impressed with Elizabeth's first page one. Byline in the journal. Elizabeth was beaming. Then Tony's assistant leaned in to whisper something to her. She jumped up and walked quickly to the corner of the room where Emily saw her taking a phone call. What was so frightfully urgent that she couldn't wait until after the press conference? Emily whispered to Jessica, who shrugged. "Thank you all for your concern in the last few weeks," Eliana said into the microphone. "As you can see, the rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated," she continued. The reporters laughed, but Emily thought that Lord Pembroke looked uncomfortable. "I have not been to Japan, and I most assuredly did not elope with a member of the palace guard." "What happened to the Liverpudlian accent?" Emily whispered to Jessica. "She's so poised and polished," Jessica marveled. "Like a princess." "In reality," the princess continued, "I behaved a bit badly and I apologize for any grief I may have caused my family and anyone else." She smiled at David. "I ran away from the palace because I felt the need to escape the royal lifestyle. I wanted to learn what life is like in the real London, and thanks to a few special new friends I have learned a lot more than I ever dreamed actually. I spoke with my mother, the Queen, last night, and I have agreed to return to my family today, but there will be some changes. I will no longer be cloistered in the palace. I will be free to associate with whomever I please." She glanced warmly at David. "But the most important change is that I will begin using my position to help people." Emily heard a murmur of skepticism from the reporters behind her. The princess apparently heard it too. Eliana thought for a moment. Then she removed the microphone from its stand and moved closer to the crowd, speaking more casually. "On my way here today I saw a homeless man, only half a block from this building. He was crouched on the sidewalk, his clothing old and torn. A large hat obscured his face, as if he were ashamed to be seen. That man and others like him represent the real London. A few weeks ago I barely knew of the existence of that London, but since then I've been disguised as a Liverpudlian named Lena." She smiled and fingered her brown-dyed hair. Lena obtained a position, working in a London soup kitchen. In that soup kitchen, Lena has seen sights that Eliana would never have been exposed to. Lena has met hungry, sick people, many of them children with no place to live and few places to turn. Now that I know about that London, I want to use my position to change it. I plan to work for the poor, providing publicity and fundraising efforts to homeless shelters, soup kitchens, and similar facilities throughout the city. This time, the murmurs Emily heard behind her were of admiration. "As you all know, Lord Pembroke, the owner of the London Journal and a distant relation of mine, has generously offered the sum of £1 million for my return. In a few minutes he will present a check for that amount to David Bartholomew. Before he does, I'd like to tell you what David plans to do with that money, because I'm sure he's too modest to tell you himself." David blushed bright red. "David plans to donate that money to a London homeless shelter, to go toward a clinic where the poor can receive free medical treatment. The royal family will make up the rest from my personal trust fund, and has agreed to put David through medical school on the condition that he agree to head up that clinic as chief physician after his graduation." As the audience applauded wildly, Emily sighed, watching Eliana and David gaze into each other's eyes. "Don't you just love happy endings?" she whispered to Jessica. Jessica sighed too, but she sounded wistful. Emily remembered that Robert had disappeared the day before. "Any word from Robert?" Emily asked her, as the reporters began questioning Eliana and David. Jessica shook her head and blinked rapidly, as if she was trying not to cry. "I'm sorry," Emily said. "I guess you must miss him a lot." "I do," Jessica whispered back. "I love Robert, and he loves me." She cast a venomous glare at Elizabeth, who had just returned to her seat. "I just wish some people would mind their own business and stop spreading terrible stories about him." Elizabeth had a stricken look in her eyes. "I'm so sorry to have to tell you this, Jessica," she whispered, motioning Luke and Lucy to gather closer as, "Well, that was Sergeant Bumpo on the phone with the results of the forensic study." "Bumpo?" Emily asked, amused. "Isn't he the funny little chap who handles Scotland Yard's lost dog cases?" For some reason the others looked terribly serious. Dead serious. The silk threads definitely came from Robert's robe, Elizabeth said. And the analysis also showed traces of fur on the robe, the same fur that was found in the doorway. Jessica's face lost all color. Somebody planted it there, she whispered. No, they did. That's not all, Elizabeth continued. She took a deep breath and turned to Luke. Bumpo hasn't completed the analysis of the fur, but he's certain of one thing. It definitely came from a wolf. I don't understand any of this, Emily said. What's going on? Luke shook his head at her. It's a long story, he said. And this is no place for a lengthy explanation. I'd better fill Tony in on the results, Lucy said quickly, rising from her seat. From the warm light in her eyes, Emily guessed that discussing the evidence wasn't the only thing Lucy had on her mind. Suddenly, a reporter from another newspaper jumped to her feet and pointed with her pencil at Andrew Thatcher, who had been standing off to one side. Chief Thatcher, she asked loudly, you have been searching for the missing princess for 2 weeks with no luck. Why is it that the entire London police department could not find one missing girl while 2 teenage tourists were able to break the story? Thatcher stalked to the microphone, annoyed. Hasn't the media wasted enough time on this story? He asked, staring at the reporters in disgust. With all due respect to the princess and the royal family, there is a situation afoot in London that is exceedingly more momentous. The room quieted. At Emily's side, Jessica was absolutely still, her face still ashen. My department has a suspect in the murder of Joy Singleton, Thatcher announced. And that suspect is also wanted for questioning concerning the deaths of Dr. Cameron Neville, Nurse Dolores Handley, and Maria Finch, a cook. At Pembroke Manor, the victims all bled to death from wounds on their throats. Rather like the mauling of a large animal. The police will make the arrest. He cast a dark glare at Lord Pembroke. As soon as the suspect can be located. Murder, Emily whispered to Jessica. The newspaper said the doctor died of natural causes. And what's this about a cook? She stopped when she saw that the American girl wasn't paying any attention to her. Instead, Jessica was staring at Thatcher, shaking her head as if she were pleading with him. Remarkably, Lord Pembroke had adopted exactly the same posture. Emily had no idea what was happening. Thatcher stared grimly at Pembroke and shook his own head almost imperceptibly. Then Pembroke sighed and walked with a heavy tread out of the building. After watching him leave, Thatcher took a deep breath and made his final announcement, in a voice that revealed a mixture of determination and regret, but mostly just exhaustion. A warrant has been filed for the arrest of Sir Robert Pembroke, Jr. Jessica felt as if she were plunging into a deep black pit. The chief of the London Police Department was standing in front of her, calmly telling a group of reporters that the boy she loved was a psychotic killer. At least he hadn't mentioned the werewolf theory. Lord Pembroke is cooperating with the police in every way, Thatcher said in response to a reporter's question, though he firmly believes that his son is innocent. Jessica caught a sarcastic glance between Elizabeth and Luke. If he thinks his son is innocent, then why did he skedaddle out of here? Another reporter demanded. Lord Pembroke is understandably distraught, but he has assured me that he does not know his son's whereabouts at the present time. Elizabeth reached over to lay a hand on Jessica's arm. Suddenly Jessica's despair turned to fury. This is all your fault, she hissed, knowing her voice was covered by the chaos that had followed Thatcher's announcement. Some reporters were rushing to the phones to call their offices, others were shouting questions at Thatcher, and a third group had torn out of the room in pursuit of Pembroke. Jessica focused her rage on her sister. That's what you were being so secretive about last night. You must have called Thatcher with your so-called evidence against Robert, even after we agreed nobody would go to the police with it. Elizabeth shook her head.
No, Jessica.
I didn't call the police. I was being secretive about the princess story. It was Tony I called last night to set up this press conference. I didn't know Thatcher would make this announcement. Yes, you did, because you told him to. Calm down, Jessica, Elizabeth urged. It must have been Lord Pembroke himself who told the police about the evidence. Remember Thatcher's ultimatum. He wanted the truth by 10 o'clock last night. Jessica jumped from her seat. It's not the truth, she cried. And Lord Pembroke never would have turned over evidence about his son. But you would. You've hated Robert all along. Yes, that is correct, she heard Thatcher saying calmly. We have established a connection between a total of 4 deaths, and we now believe them all to be murders, violent, grisly murders. Suddenly, Jessica saw the body of Dr. Neville, sprawled on the floor in a pool of blood that stained the floral carpeting. She saw Joy's blonde head looking so much like her own, in the midst of crimson-spattered sheets, and she felt coarse hair scrape against her arm, while the sound of heavy panting echoed through the deserted subway station. Robert was not the murderer, a werewolf, but somebody in London was, and until he was found, Jessica knew that her own life was in danger. Suddenly she felt more vulnerable than she had ever felt in her life. Without Robert here to protect her, she would have to rely on herself. Somebody bumped one of the bright television lights, and its reflection caught Jessica's eye flashing off the anti-werewolf pendant that hung around Elizabeth's neck. A shiver skated down her spine, but Jessica thought about Robert's strong arms and warm kisses, and she swallowed her fear. I love Robert, Jessica said aloud, though nobody was listening to her. She straightened her shoulders and looked around her with a new grim resolve. And I'll do whatever is necessary to clear his name.